All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for attending. I know this is most likely your last session of the day, and I know we're all eager to get off to the event party after this, but I really do appreciate you being here. Today we're gonna talk about how to run a successful Azure migration project. Now, I'm Rob Keefus, and for those of you that don't know me, I'm in our customer success organization. And I lead our Azure platform tech strategy in our CSU. Our customer success organization, for those that are not aware, we work with all sorts of customers all across the globe on helping them on their Azure journeys. In the Azure platform tech strategy role, we look at patterns that our cloud solution architects or challenges that our customers have, and we look at those patterns, and then we look to say, how can we accelerate those patterns? How can we create IP or solutions that help not only our customers that we work directly with, but also our partners and our customers themselves that can self-service, also utilize the things that our team builds. And so today, to talk about migration, we've got a lot to cover. I'm gonna first quickly go into just a little bit of how this is still relevant and why this is still relevant today. And then we're gonna go through some of the, in a way you can think of them as tips or best practices, certainly things that we have learned working with customers in the customer success unit over the years. Now, I'm gonna give you some things that are relatively new and some things you may be a little bit familiar with, but it's still really good for you to be grounded on some of these items. All right, and then last, I've got some things to share with you around, because it's gonna be a lot that I'm gonna go through, on how maybe you can take advantage of some programs that we have or some offerings that may actually help you get started and actually utilize some of the tips and things that I'm gonna share with you today. Okay, so first off, I cannot possibly start a session here today without talking a little bit about AI. And you're like, oh my gosh, but Rob, we're talking about migration here, but how is it still relevant? Well, the thing I would say is that, with AI, like any other new tool or innovation that's happening, right? Everybody wants to use it, right? Everybody wants to get started with it. And you're thinking, okay, well, I really want to get AI, but I haven't really even done that much with Azure yet, maybe. Or maybe you've done some things with Azure, but you're still not complete with your migration projects. What's really important to share with you is that if you're looking to say, hey, I want to take some of those capabilities of AI, I think they will really help me in my day-to-day life. They will help the business. They may even work across organization. What we have learned when we've talked to a bunch of customers, we've done some survey and some polling, a couple things to share with you here is first off that, if you talk to a customer that's gone on the AI journey and they're kind of an early adopter of it, they absolutely agree that they needed to first make sure that they worked through their migration projects first. Customers that have done a lot of migration projects or moved much of their digital portfolio into Azure have been more successful and faster working with AI. So migration is still really, really important for all of us. Right? So if you think about man, I really want to take advantage of all the cool things that I've seen this week, right? But yet I'm still not quite there with migration. I'm hoping this session here today will kind of give you some ideas, some things to look out for, some things that we have learned with customers, and that you will say, we still need to really double down on this to get through this so that we can adopt AI a little bit quicker. Okay, so when we do talk about migration, there's always going to be different areas or things that you need to think about, and we kind of carve them up for you in really 3 areas. There's going to be readiness and foundational things. I've got some really good tips for you here that I'm going to walk you through today. Then there's always going to be design and governance, right? Hey, I know what I need to do foundationally. I've skilled my team, but we've got to make sure that we have the right architectural designs, we've prioritized the right investments there, and we're starting to put a governance model in place, okay? And then the last thing is, now that I've got this stuff up and running in Azure, I feel really excited about this, but I got to manage and operate this. It's not the day 1, right? It's the day 100. What happens then? So I've got some things here that I'm going to work with you. I cannot possibly, in the 45 minutes that I have with you today, cover all of the items that I've got listed here, but I did bold the ones that I thought were really important that I did want to spend a little time going through and sharing what we learned, working with real customers on migration projects, so you all could kind of glean some information from that, and I have lots of links and things for you as well, okay? All right, so any migration project that you're gonna do is gonna need to start, right, with an initial discovery or assessment. And you're like, oh, well, maybe that's not really super exciting. But you have to understand what you've got, and you've got to start to organize it so you can actually make progress. One thing that I've seen that a pitfall that we've certainly experienced is you'll go into a customer environment, and they will identify every single asset that they've got running, right? And they are gonna try to organize it and categorize it and figure out, like, how do I rationalize these items? And that analysis paralysis never actually gets them to migrate anything. And before you know it, you check back with that customer, it's been like 3 months, and they're like, yeah, we're still looking, we're still reviewing things, but we haven't actually gone ahead and moved anything yet into the cloud. And they say, well, why? Well, because we want to get the perfect plan. I want you all to know that if perfect is your goal, that is not the right mentality you need to take here. You need to start with maybe a list of 10, build a backlog of your different applications and workloads, and start to organize them. Like I said, rationalize what you have. If you actually look in the Cloud Adoption Framework, the guidance has been there for some time, and they have they call it the 5 R's, right, of migration. So what things should I rehost? What should I retire, right? What should be replaced, refactored, right? These are the things that they help you to kind of group them. And here's an example I'm going to give you. Because everybody likes to know, well, Microsoft, what did you do, right? How did you do this? So when Microsoft went through this journey, they had about 3,500 applications that they had to kind of rationalize and figure out, what are they going to do with them? Because, of course, they wanted to move as much of it as they can, because not everything could be moved to Azure. As you can see there in the bottom, there was a few things that couldn't be moved. But how did they go about doing this? And so, again, they rationalized it, and they kind of put it in these buckets. What things should I retire? And you can see they actually felt that, between retirement, right-sizing, or eliminating some environments, about 30% of what they discovered, they probably didn't need anymore. Remember, when you're running in a data center on-prem, there's some things running there that no one's probably shut down that aren't probably really being utilized that much. So you don't want to migrate those things, right? We just want to go ahead and retire those. But then as we go through the system, we're like, all right, then there's a certain set of things that we can modernize, right, by refactoring. And when you do that, you're going to move it into maybe say, hey, can I replace this with a SaaS service, whether it's a Microsoft SaaS service or a third-party SaaS service, doesn't matter, as long as you kind of identify that, hey, I shouldn't be running this anymore, and I want to do that. And then, of course, there's some things that you could get some small wins with, just, hey, I'm going to convert it to a PaaS service, and I'm not going to just, basically rehost it or lift and shift it. I'm going to convert it to a PaaS service. You kind of work through these things in your applications, right, and organize them. So this is just one example that, and the slide may be a slightly old, but it's still very true about how we looked at our portfolio of applications and how we organized things. This is really important to do, because if you don't have a good handle on this, I think a lot of migration projects stall out pretty quickly because they go back to, well, what about this and what about that? So you want to just organize, build that backlog, and when people bring up new things, get it on the backlog, say we're going to do the analysis, figure out the right path for that particular workload, and we're going to keep going. Okay, the last thing to share with you on the discovery and assessment side is we have a free tool for you. So if you don't want to do this by manual, or you don't want to use your CMDB or whatever you've got going on in your particular organization, we have a tool that will help you discover, it's going to help you assess, and it actually can help you do the migration work and modernize work as well, all right? But specifically on the Discover Assess, even if you don't use it to move a single workload to Azure, it gives you really good analysis of what you've got, right? It helps you find some of the dependencies for your workloads, right? And it helps you estimate what your costs are going to be as you move these things. So Azure Migrate's a free tool. I know that there was a session earlier this week that you could actually go check out. If you weren't there earlier, you could check out the recording. But it's a great tool that we've made available for you to help you work through that. Just, like I said, even if you only use it for the discovery and assessment piece. Okay, second tip. This one is another one that comes up all the time. And one of the slowest migration adoptions that we have seen working with customers is like, hey, they've done all the assessment, they got their things, they picked their first workload, they know what to do, and they go ahead and they migrate it into Azure. They've got it up and running in Azure. They feel really good about it. They tested it. It's doing all the right business flows. And then they say, well, I want to move it into production, right? Okay, great. They want to move it into production. And they say, but quickly we have the security checklist. And I got to give this over to a security person, and they've got to go through that checklist, and they've got to make sure and sign off before I could actually officially cut over to the one running in Azure. And that's when the wheels fall off, because security's like, yeah, I wasn't involved in the beginning of the planning. There's regulatory and compliance checks that would need to happen here. We need to do a full review, and we also may even have our own custom controls that we need to evaluate to understand if we can even run this the way that you've architected it in Azure. This really does slow down a lot of the migrations. It's important, first off, to please bring security in the beginning so they're aware and they're working with you, so they kind of get in front of these, but also that you go through and use some of our tooling to help accelerate this. So what do we have for you? So there is something called Microsoft Cloud Security Benchmark. I don't know if any of you are aware of that this exists, but it is available. So you could actually go and, so you of course could go and look at all the guidance that's out there. But of course, if you go in Defender for Cloud, we have this available in there as well, all right? And what this does is it basically will show you all of the security compliance checks, and it actually has mappings to some of the regulatory compliance things that you need. So for example, there's going to be a NIST in there, PCI will be in there. You'll have HIPAA in there, right? So a lot of them there. We'll basically say these are all the security controls that we've outlined in the security benchmark, and then we'll also evaluate what you put up in Azure and tell you where you're meeting them. And some things that do need to be manually checked, it'll tell you what those are. You could export all the reports, and you can run it reoccurring if you want to, okay? So this really helps move things along for you, because I will tell you, going through one of these, hey, I got to take all my controls and compare them to what you have, it could be very exhausting and very long. This really helps accelerate that for you. And so I want you all to make sure that you're aware of that and to use this, because this will absolutely help you on any migration project that you work with. All right. If you were to look at the Microsoft Cloud Security Benchmark, and I do have a URL for you on a slide towards the end. What we do basically is we go ahead and first define and publish the benchmark, okay? We do update it as things change. We do refresh it, okay? Then we standardize this, okay, across all Azure services. So basically all the Azure services that are out there, we want to standardize it so you get the same look and feel no matter which services you need to evaluate for your security controls. And then we automate this with Microsoft Defender for Cloud, so you don't have to actually run any kind of scripts or PowerShells or manually click through 100 different screens in the portal. We do all of this for you so that you have it right at your fingertips, and then you can go ahead and just understand basically where you sit, and of course work with your security team for their sign-off so you can move it into production, okay? So that's tip number 2, and that one really helps, like I said, speed and move things along. Now, Azure Landing Zone. This is probably I believe it's my last one in Foundation, but first off, quick show of hands. Has anybody here heard of Azure Landing Zone? All right, excellent. So remember when I introduced myself, customer success, what we do is we learn from working with customers. One big learning we had, and towards the, I don't know, I would say I would give it about 5 or 6 years ago, is our cloud solution architects would go into a customer, and they were all basically solving the same problem, which was a landing zone. And they would have to figure it out on their own without any script or guidance or anything like that. And so what we did is we basically went to all of these CSAs, worked with them, and documented everything they were doing with these customers. Hey, what did you do how did you organize your resource groups? What worked, what didn't? What did the customer say? How did you handle identity? How did you do the network? What about monitoring? What about management? What about automation and DevOps? We learned so much from the field on how they actually went ahead and did this with real customers and what was proven to work. We then said, let's get all this guidance and document it in the cloud adoption framework. So we created the design principles, and then we created 8 areas of design, right, that really deeply outline how you build your landing zone, which was awesome. But they would say, well, it would still take us a really long time to actually go ahead and roll this out and implement this. I think a typical project with the customer at that time was maybe just to get their landing zone stood up. I want to say it was like 4 or 5 months. I think that's what we were looking at, about 4 or 5 months. We said, like, hey, how can we get this down to like 12 weeks, or maybe 8 weeks? And where we have it now is just remarkable. But we actually then said, let's create actual reference architectures and reference implementations. So the first one we built was Portal. So if all of you aren't aware, you can actually go and click Deploy Azure Landing Zones. You can just go like to AKA MS ALZ, Deploy Azure Landing Zone, and you have a full portal-based experience. It takes you through all the design areas. It does default to what is prescriptive from Microsoft, so that means what we recommend, but you can absolutely customize it to your customer needs, right? And as you work your way through it, and then it'll actually deploy, right? And it'll actually stamp out the Azure Landing Zone architecture, and I'll show you what that looks like in a second. But we also then said, that's great. Not everybody wants to use Portal. Some customers want to get in there, and they say, hey, we're more of an infrastructure as code. We want to use templates. We want modules, so we can kind of pick and choose through the templates what we want to do. So then we created, we originally started with ARM templates, but then we moved to Bicep, which is available today, and you have Terraform for infrastructure as code. And by the way, all this we maintain and update every month to keep it on the latest and greatest. If any issues come in, we fix it. This is something that you can trust will be there for you and that you can rely on. And then the last thing we said is, well, what if I have like SAP, right? What if I'm doing AVM, right? How about that? Like, I see you've done this foundational landing zone, but I've got a specific workload that I want to run in Azure, and I would like that to work. So what we did is we created landing zone accelerators. By the way, all of these are available, and you can see the full list of all the accelerators, as well as the platform landing zone and the Azure Architecture Center. It's just on the left-hand side underneath landing zones. It's all there documented for you, and you can pick and choose whichever ones you want to use. But the landing zone accelerators are great because, of course, it helps you to get the workload up and running, and it aligns to the platform landing zone. So if you were to deploy Azure Landing Zone and you were to follow the portal or follow one of our accelerators, right, you would get something that looks like this, right? You would get the full architectural diagram. It's very detailed. Why is it done this way, by the way? Because we wanted to make sure we have what we call the platform landing zone, which are the subscriptions you could think of as your shared services, right? Where's your monitoring? Where's your network, right? Where's your identity? Those are your shared services. So that's the platform landing zone. That's the stuff that gets initially deployed. Then if you say, hey, I want to use a landing zone accelerator, you're going to have like an application landing zone, and that would be the subscriptions where like SAP would be running or Azure Virtual Desktop would be running, okay? So Azure Landing Zone, just so you know, is something that, like I said, we update and mature it every single month. As Azure innovates, we innovate the landing zone, okay? The heart of Azure Landing Zone, or maybe what I would call the engine of Azure Landing Zone, is policy. We have an unbelievable amount of policy. There must be, I don't know, is it about 120, 130 policies right now with Azure Landing Zone? So it's a policy driven architecture. Why is that important? Because it keeps you in the guardrails, right? If you drift out of the policy of configuration of what we recommend for your landing zone, you'll be aware of that. We're going to make you aware of that. We could either have it as a deny, or maybe it would be something like, say, deploy if not exist policy. I deployed a VM, but I forgot to put backup on it. The backup policy just says, oh, I got to put backup on that VM, and it just kicks off and does it, right? So it helps keeping you in, I would say, in control of what people are putting and building in Azure. All right. The other thing I would tell you is that we do 2 things here that we really, really stress. We focus on security and resiliency in the Azure Landing Zone. Any of the resources and things that we deploy, it's going to be secure and it's going to be resilient, right? We want to make sure that when you start with Landing Zone, you have a foundation for long-term success in Azure. You cannot have long-term success unless you are resilient and secure. So we make sure both of those are baked into it in everything we do, okay? So last thing I would tell you, it's agnostic. So if you have this application or that application or this amazing new thing that you want to run in Azure, it should always work in Azure Landing Zone. You should always be able to snap it in there, okay? Of course, I can't spend forever here, but I would just like to say that if you have any feedback on it or if you have any questions on it, you can come find me after because it's generally a fairly large topic. Oh, there we go. Okay, so the third one to talk about is costs, right? I haven't talked about costs yet, and I know when we talk about migration, a lot of people will say, oh my gosh, like, is it gonna cost me more? Is it gonna cost me less? You know, how do I handle costs? And this is more of a relatively new learning. So originally we would say, well, you know, people would move things into Azure and then they would cost optimize it, right? That's probably what they did. I mean, they would get some estimates there, but we're kind of changing that a little bit and saying that we want to build a FinOps or a financial operations kind of mindset with the customer. When we start these migration projects, we should start thinking about FinOps. Why is that? Because really, in order to really have a good handle on cost, you really need the whole organization to think about what is the strategy for cost? How do I think about this? Whether I'm a developer or a platform engineer, right? I should still think about how this is going to affect costs and what are my costs, right? So FinOps is a framework. It's an industry-wide framework. It's something that really came, I want to say, really came to light, I'd say about 3 years ago. It really bubbled up. And Microsoft, of course, we're a part of the FinOps Foundation. We participate in all of this, and we've learned a lot from customers that have gone on their FinOps journeys, and customers that have done a lot of migration projects have found some really good things out of FinOps that have helped them. So first off, it is a framework, okay? It does help you manage your costs, but I think what's important here, it maximizes your cloud business value. What does that mean? Like, we don't want you spending money on the wrong things, right? So when you migrate stuff into Azure, but then it doesn't get utilized very much, or it wasn't right size, or it's not using the right, savings plan or reserved instance, or, it's not taking advantage of all the things that it should be. That's not what we want to see. We want to see you spending money on the things that really are there to grow your business and to help you. So FinOps helps you, puts like this framework around it to help you get all of that in control and build this culture in your environment. There's a lot to the FinOps framework, by the way, and you could see this, but something just to you probably say, oh my gosh, look at all those domains, look at all those capabilities. One thing that's really interesting about the way that we've done, or that the FinOps Foundation have done this, is they have a crawl, walk, run maturity model. So as you work through the things that are most important to you, say, hey, first thing is just visualizing my costs. That's what's important for me and my organization. We're gonna migrate a lot of things, but we gotta be able to visualize the costs so people can see what they're spending, so they understand, right? Well, you could say, well, maybe like having like a really robust dynamic dashboard in the run phase is maybe not realistic for you, but there is crawl. Right? And in crawl, we may say, well, hey, start here. There's some native tools, and then you can enhance these tools, and you can eventually get to run. They do that for every single domain and capability in FinOps, and they break it all out for you, so you can actually get a good sense of how am I actually going to go ahead and onboard this as I migrate to Azure. So I do have a link for this one as well for you all at the end, and the link is an assessment to say, hey, if you've started migrating, and you're like, hey, I'd like to look at FinOps and just see where I currently live, there's a really good assessment there that should at least give you an idea of what you're looking at. All right, so I know I talked earlier a little bit about Azure Migrate, right? And that's a fantastic free tool, and it will 100% help you do the discovery, and assessment, and do some dependency finding. It's going to help you do some cost estimates, right? So that's wonderful, right? But then when it comes to actually doing the migration itself, you may find when you look at the tool, like, maybe I don't want to do a lift and shift, or there's a few different things it does. It will actually help you to move like a server maybe into a PaaS-based service. But you may find a lot of scenarios that doesn't quite fit for you. And you're like, all right, well, now what do I do? Or you may have a lot of workloads that you're going to move into Azure, and you don't want to create hundreds and hundreds of migrate projects with the Azure Migrate tool. We have found a lot of customers that do, like, say, a data center exit have been very successful using infrastructure as code. And what we learned doing actual customer engagements is these customers would write libraries of all the services, all the ARM templates in little modules, right? And they'd say, hey, here's my virtual machine template, and here's my storage account template, and here's my app service template, right? And here's my Cosmos DB template. And they started building these libraries of templates, right? And they would have this huge collection of them, and they would say to their application teams, we need to move in Azure. I am approving these templates for you to use. And so then the developers would take those templates, they would kind of stitch them together, run the templates maybe in a pipeline, and then it would stamp out an environment for them, and then they would restore their application. But the customers struggled with a couple areas. One, how do they keep the templates updated? As I told you earlier with Azure Landing Zone, we have to update and maintain that every month. There's new innovation in Azure. We've got to update Azure Landing Zone so the customers have the latest and greatest. Well, it's the same problem with infrastructure as code, but actually probably worse, because in Landing Zone, we maybe have like 14 services, but there's actually hundreds of Azure services. So we built a library we call Azure Verified Modules. It's got both Bicep and Terraform modules for you, okay? What we've done is we go through each service and think of them as building blocks for you. And you can say, hey, I want to stamp out my environment, from what it was on-prem. I'm going to need to stamp it out into Azure. You can basically take these building blocks, hook them together. Each building block follows the well-architected framework. We make sure that we put the right defaults in there for you and give you the option, of course. You can change the defaults, but you would have to go in there and make a conscious effort not to take a well-architected framework recommendation. We made sure we started with resiliency and security for those recommendations. So if you grab a module, say for virtual machine, just keep it simple, right? You would find that it has all the resiliency by default recommendations that you would find in the well-architected framework. So for example, it would be something that it would when you go to deploy, you would have to say, hey, how many, I want to configure zones, and I would say, all right, this one's going to go in zone 1, 2, or 3. You would actually have to set that, right? You can't just let it just go to chance. So you may have like a zonal deployment with your VM. We do the same thing with security. So for whether it's like encryption, that we should always default to using encryption for a particular service. We made sure that that's actually in the code. Okay, everything we've done here, why do we call it verified modules? Because what we do is we write the modules, and then we sit down with the engineering owner, review it with them, make sure that they are on board with what we've done, right? And that they've signed off. And they correct us and course correct us where needed. Like they say, oh, no, that should be the default, or you should change that there. We make those changes so you could really trust that these verified modules. By the way, we publish these in the Bicep registry and the Terraform registry as well. And of course, I have a short link for you on the screen, and I've got a slide at the end with all the rest. In my talk tomorrow, we do touch also on Azure Verified Modules as well. And I have like I go in a little bit more depth on it to show you kind of a little bit of what it looks like and all the work that's gone behind that, so you can ensure that you have a well-maintained library that you can use to build and stamp out and construct your workloads in Azure for your migrations. Okay. So this is really 2 tips. But I put them in 1 tip. I don't know if that was cheating or not. But organizational alignment. So I talked a little bit about Azure Landing Zone. By the way, if you use Azure Landing Zone, we did that as a cloud operating model. It's to facilitate that kind of behavior at the customer. What do we mean? If you were to use Azure Landing Zone, you could run it with a platform engineering team, and then each of your application teams, right, would have their own landing zone with their own subscriptions where they can innovate without having to go back to the platform engineering team asking for VMs or storage or permissions or all these things. They can operate within that boundary. This is to help facilitate that kind of organizational alignment. This organizational alignment really starts to take shape, though, when you start to say, hey, and most of you will start with like a V team, but you're going to start to build a center of excellence, right? And you've probably heard that, and it's called a cloud center of excellence. But it's that governing body that puts those processes, what are the things that we should adhere to in our company, what are the compliance and regulatory needs that we have. They bring that all together in that group. And it's usually in the beginning. I have found working with customers that it's just a V team, to be honest with you, when you start. And eventually that V team does mature into more of a full-time governance body that kind of, meets weekly or maybe monthly and shows, hey, these are the things that we need to do to, drive like the right behaviors when people put new things in the cloud in our organization. So that does dovetail pretty nicely, though, into governance. Because without that organizational alignment, it's really, really hard to do governance in any customer that does it. And governance is really important because, again, when you're going to migrate a bunch of things into Azure, right, you're going to keep migrating. You're going to build like an engine of migration. You want to make sure people are staying within the rules, right? What do I mean by rules? Well, if you look down on the bottom, they have 5 disciplines that are documented in the CAF. But you could think of it as, so what's an example of cost management? Well, maybe there's a particular SKU that's maybe very expensive that you do not want your application teams to use. You would agree in your center of excellence team that we should decide what VMs are allowed, like what VM SKUs are allowed, or what app service plans are allowed and which ones are not allowed, and we can put policy in place to enforce that so they can't accidentally use something that you didn't approve. And that, if you think of that example kind of works all the way down the line. Security baseline. I actually touched on this as I think it was my second tip, right? Of course, you need to understand what are the things that we need to put in place to keep everybody in the baseline so they don't drift out of it, and when we get audited, we don't have a bad day. Resource consistency, think of that as like, hey, what's my tagging convention going to look like? Right? You're going to probably need to put metadata on every resource that you deploy. Like, is it going to say prod? Is it going to be non-prod? Like, what's the naming convention that you're going to use when you name a resource? And what's the tagging strategy that you're going to have? That organization, that center of excellence team should decide that, and then you use the governance methodology, which is a lot of policy, right, to help enforce those guardrails. So somebody can't forget to not put a tag on a device or on a resource that's going to go into production. Like, you just don't want to see that, because then they say, hey, we're doing a review and we missed some things that should have been included in that review, maybe for a security audit or something like that, because they weren't tagged as production. So it's really important to do resource consistency. And of course, there's going to be identity baseline. If you are following Landing Zone, there's a full design area that aligns and basically is probably the North Star example of how to build your identity baseline. And then of course there's deployment acceleration. And that is again where it comes into infrastructure as code, DevOps, building pipelines, right? Azure verified modules should really help you as a governing team or your center of excellence. They should standardize on these are the templates that we should be using. These are the pieces. If you do it, if everybody is their own unique template snowflake, when you're working between different development teams and the platform engineering team comes in to review one thing and then reviews the next thing, it's very hard for them to get context and switch. So that consistency really, really helps, and it accelerates things a lot in the customer. All right. My last tip for you, all right, is one that's the most near and dear to me right now. And in fact, I have an entire talk on this tomorrow. Resiliency is going to be something that I would say that from a migration perspective, you need to make sure you're always thinking about, as you migrate things into Azure, is it going to survive, an outage? What does that mean? Like, would it survive a zonal outage? Would it survive a region outage? What if you had, something that happened like a disk fail or something like that? Making sure when you do migrations that you build resiliency into the architecture that you land in Azure is very important. Now, if you use verified modules, say in the example, we built those into those modules. If you use other third-party tools or even Azure Migrate, it may not have shifted it with resiliency. So you need to make sure that this is top of mind and something that you're looking at and thinking about. The best way, of course, to do resiliency, and why I'm telling you this, and I believe me, no one knows better than I do how painful these resiliency things can be. Nothing's easier than doing it right on day one with starting with resilience. So if you're gonna migrate something from on-prem into Azure, just start resilient. Just start there. Make sure you've used Azure Landing Zone. You're following our best practices. You've done that due diligence, especially if it's a mission-critical workload, right? Because you don't want to fall into a trap where, oh my gosh, we just migrated, 1,000 different workloads over the last 18 months. And now we're starting to realize that on most of them, we didn't use these SKUs that would have made it zonal. So it can't be, we couldn't be zonal redundant on some of the things that we've done. And now we have to go back and make it zonal redundant. Well, my gosh, now we have a planned outage we have to deal with, right? And nobody wants to deal with planned outages. So making sure that you've done resiliency is really important. So we have a strategy for this. It's start resilient, which is mostly what this discussion is about, right? Because we're talking about migration. So if you get anything from me today, please make sure that you're following and starting resilient. But say you didn't, and so say you may or you're not sure, maybe you're just not sure. We do have some good tooling and tips for you for getting resilient. And then, of course, once you are there and resilient, you don't want to drift out of resiliency, right? And then, so you want to stay resilient, okay? So we have like a nice like framework or lifestyle, and I have our life cycle for this. And I've got a talk tomorrow, I think it's at 10 or 10:30 a.m. To check out, and it will help you to learn more about this. But on the specific topic, say you didn't, say you are all on your migration journeys and my talk didn't come in time for you, okay? So you want to understand, like, well, I better go look at some of the things that I've already migrated and just take a peek at them. We've built something called the Azure Proactive Resiliency Library. What this is you'll find a list of all the Azure services, okay? And you will find the resiliency recommendations for every service, and these recommendations are prioritized by low, medium, high impact. So you may want to focus on the high impact ones to start because you don't want to, boil the ocean on day one. So the way we've done this is, and of course, if you were to manually go through all of these, you'd be clicking through that portal or going through PowerShell. It would take you, weeks to go through. We've built a lot of automation for this as well for you. So if you were to look at a lot of the recommendations, you'll see that there is actually an Azure Resource Graph query that's available for you. So that helps you to action the guidance for, like, saying, utilizing zones or whatever the resiliency recommendation is. And so you run that query and it says, okay, this resource is, adhering to this one, but, it's found, this one over here, you need to address. We wrote some scripting to go along with it. We're going to actually demo it tomorrow, where you can run a script against a subscription. You can scope that to a resource group, and it also supports tags. And so you can say, hey, I just want to run it against this set of resources and just tell me all my resiliency gaps, and it will give you a comprehensive report by service for that workload of all the resiliency gaps that you have. And the ones that we cannot automate, it will at least call out for you that says you have to do a manual check. You have to just go and look, okay, to make sure that you've done it. We also have some links in there, of course, so it gives you all this information, but how do you remediate it? Because really, that's really great that you know where your gaps are, but we want you to remediate these things as well, because that's really where the value comes in. We also give you some information around, like, where do you go to actually remediate the particular gap that may have come up. So the Proactive Resiliency Library, it's available right now. I have a link, the link is here on the slide I see, and I do have it again in my list coming up. So speaking of that list, there it is. So these are the things that I went through with you. And I know it's a lot. I admit it. It's a whirlwind tour. We have a lot of learnings from doing migration projects. And I wanted to give you just one place shop to go where you could at least see each of the tips, where to go, where to learn more, build these into your migration plans, make sure you're covering these if you have checklists, however you're doing this. All of these things will absolutely help you and avoid a lot of pitfalls. Now, how do you get help from Microsoft, right? Well, I'm happy to say that we do have help for you. Of course we have help for you. We actually have 3 offerings to talk to you about. Okay, so if you just want, hey, I need some help here. So the first one, Azure Innovate. If you're unaware what Azure Innovate is, say you just you've identified something really cool that you want to build in Azure. It's got analytics, it's got AI. That's the program for you. You can actually scan the QR code with your phone, go there, and you could just basically raise your hand and say, I would like Microsoft's help to build something really interesting and new that I want to try in Azure. For today's discussion, of course, there's the Azure Migrate and Modernize program, okay? And that's, of course, like saying, hey, we want to do a migration into Azure. We've identified some things, but we need someone to look at the plan, to, help us come up with how we should best go about doing this, and help us kind of map this all out. We would like Microsoft to come in and give us a hand with this. That's the Azure Migrate and Modernize, so that's where that will help you. And the newest offering that we have is Azure Essentials. So say you actually already have migrated some of your things in Azure, and you're working through your migration projects, right? But you didn't know about the resiliency thing, but you're like, oh man, I need some help there. I'd really like to have a Microsoft person maybe help me out with that. We have Azure Essentials. The first thing we started with in that program or that offering is to help you be resilient. So that's the last one to check out for you. I have some examples here. If you're like wondering, well, I'm still not quite sure, Rob, I know you just explained it, but I just need a few examples to quite understand which program I should be pulling on, depending on what I need. We did put some examples here for you, so hopefully that will give you an idea of where to best, come and look and find an offering. So, these offerings are free, by the way. So, please just check it out. Like, if I absolutely encourage you to do that. And with that said, I have a couple minutes left. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this back up on the screen here, just so you see the offerings that we have and the code there in case you didn't get it. I want to thank you all for coming. I know this is the last breakout session of the day before the party tonight on Navy Pier, which is super awesome. And I will step off over here, and I'll take any questions that any of you may have, okay? Thank you. Thank you so much for coming and attending.